Number 8. Xnormal de Perote. In a wooded area outside the city of Perote in Veracruz, Mexico, there's a lone concrete building that looks like it belongs in a populated area rather than in the middle of nowhere. The conspicuously out-of-place structure was built during the 1950s as a tuberculosis hospital, which explains its remote location. Known as the Escuela Normal de Perote or Perote Normal School, it also functioned as a teacher's college during its years of operation. The military seized the building during what's known as the Mexican Movement of 1968, when university students across Mexico began protesting en masse for political changes, including a shift away from the authoritarianism that dominated the country at the time. Operations at the normal school never resumed, and the building remains abandoned to this day. It's dilapidated, covered in a demonic-looking graffiti, and supposedly haunted. It's a popular attraction among explorers who are seeking an off-the-beaten-path experience, but it's also a great place for photographers due to the uninterrupted view of the surrounding area that's offered from the top floor. Number 7. Alagany Lunatic Asylum. In rural Weston, West Virginia, there's an eerie, Gothic-style building that once housed patients suffering from mental illness and addiction. Construction on the hospital, originally called the Alagany Lunatic Asylum, began during the 1850s. It was still being built when it accepted its first patients in 1864, and it was finally completed in 1881. With its own farm, dairy, water system, and cemetery, the sprawling 666-acre property was meant to be self-sufficient. It was built to house 250 patients, but quickly became overcrowded due to the tendency to institutionalize people for things that are not considered mental illnesses in today's world, including personality flaws like laziness and greed. Wives were often dropped off by their husbands, who were able to have their spouse committed without giving much of a reason. The hospital's population peaked during the 1950s at 2,600 patients. By then, the hospital was notorious for being unsanitary and for failing to properly care for patients. As a result, many people died. Nobody knows the exact number of deaths, which researchers are working to determine and have estimated to possibly be in the thousands. Patients who were deemed uncontrollable were sometimes locked in cages. Others had parts of their brain removed during forced lobotomies, and patients often languished in solitary confinement for days or months at a time. At least a handful of murders occurred over the years between the patients. The patient population at the institution decreased dramatically during the 1980s due to widespread changes in the treatment of mental illness in the United States. At the same time, the hospital's condition was deteriorating. It was closed in 1994 and now operates as a historic landmark, offering heritage and ghost tours to the public. Given the terrible things that happened at the asylum, many people believe that the ghosts of former patients continue to inhabit the building today. One of the most famous ghosts is a girl named Lily, who can be heard laughing and playing from time to time. A man named Dean, who was murdered by fellow patients, is also an established presence at the former hospital. Efforts to restore the building are ongoing, as it becomes increasingly popular as a tourist destination. Would you like to visit this creepy asylum? Let us know in the comments and hit subscribe while you're at it. Number 6. Gyeongjang Psychiatric Hospital. One of South Korea's most notorious haunted hospitals, known as the Gyeongjang Asylum, was built at the foot of a mountain in the small city of Gwangju in 1961. Legends describe this three-story structure as a torturous hellhole where vast numbers of patients died while under the care of murderous and abusive doctors. According to one myth, doctors and other staff members were often driven to madness by the patients they treated. Ever since Gyeongjang's closure in 1996, stories have circulated like wildfire, with some claiming that the hospital was shut down due to the mistreatment of patients, while another version of events revolves around the owner's mysterious death. In reality, the facility closed mainly due to financial struggles that it encountered during a period of economic downturn. By the time it shuttered its doors, the hospital desperately needed a new sewage system. Authorities would not allow it to reopen without one, leading to extensive disagreements between the owner and public officials. Negotiations were still underway when the owner died in 1997, and his children did not want to deal with the headache of getting the hospital back up and running. While the reality of Gyeongjang's closure is much less interesting than the tales people tell about doctors going insane and murdering patients, it's still likely that some disturbing things went on there. In an era when mental illness was less understood than it is today, mistreatment at psychiatric institutions was not only common, it was essentially a fixture at most residential treatment facilities. Gyeongjang also has a reputation for being one of the most haunted places in South Korea, with many explorers claiming to have seen ghosts during their visits. Number 5. Beachworth Asylum. Also known as Mayday Hills, the Beachworth Asylum was opened in 1867 in Victoria, Australia. It was one of the largest facilities of its kind in the country, consisting of 67 buildings and housing over 1,200 patients at its peak. Like many other mental hospitals of the time, the sprawling complex was designed to be self-sufficient, with its own gardens, orchards, and livestock. Patients also had access to recreation and entertainment, including a tennis court, a theater, and a cricket pavilion. The Beachworth Asylum was surrounded by what's known as a ha-ha wall. Built into a trench, the barrier looked a lot shorter to outsiders than it actually was, done on purpose to prevent the hospital from resembling a prison, and could perhaps be considered a metaphor for how things really were different behind closed doors than they seemed from the outside. More than 9,000 patients are believed to have died at Beachworth, where individuals were allegedly subjected to treatments that are considered inhumane today. In 1951, 11 male patients escaped, while a fire raged through one of the buildings. According to a newspaper report from the time, around 400 mostly naked men had to be rescued from inside the burning structure. Most of the patients who passed away at the hospital were buried in unmarked graves on the property. Sadly, many of them probably didn't even need to be hospitalized. For many years, the requirements to get someone committed were extremely basic, requiring little more than the signatures of a family member and a doctor. But getting released was a lot more difficult, at one point requiring 8 signatures testifying to the patient's ability to function normally in society and daily life. This meant that if someone felt inconvenienced by a troubled family member or a husband no longer felt like dealing with his wife, they could have that person put away pretty easily just by claiming that they needed to be institutionalized. Beachworth was shut down for good in 1995 after operating for 128 years. Today it's open to visitors, many of whom hope to have a paranormal encounter with one of its many resident ghosts. One of the more commonly seen entities is a woman named Matron Sharp, who reportedly used to sit with patients while they received electroconvulsive shock treatments. Visitors are also known to encounter a groundskeeper named Arthur, who worked in the garden. Both patients and doctors alike are rumored to wander the asylum's halls as if they remain stuck there, even in death. Number 4. The Willard Asylum for the Insane. Described by Insider as one of the creepiest abandoned hospitals in the United States, the Willard Asylum for the Insane was the country's largest mental institution at one time. Opened in 1869 in Seneca County, New York, the hospital was built as an alternative to placing mentally ill people in poorhouses, where they languished in squalid conditions without proper care and were often mistreated. The Willard Asylum was designed to treat patients suffering from all forms of mental illness who were unable to care for themselves and had nobody else to care for them. Male and female patients were housed separately, and the staff also kept individuals who were deemed violent separate from those who were considered non-violent. By 1877, the hospital was home to 1,500 patients who were treated humanely and afforded a relative degree of freedom compared to the conditions at most asylums at the time. Many were allowed to roam the property, and the facility's farm provided jobs to those who were well enough to work while also offering recreational activities. But there was also a dark side to things that went on at Willard Asylum. Patients were often subjected to treatments that are considered inhumane by modern standards, including ice baths and electroshock therapy with no sedation. Thousands of people died at the property, including many who likely arrived under the impression that their stay would be temporary. Shortly after the Willard Asylum closed in 1995, an employee found 400 suitcases belonging to former patients in a locked attic. The bags belonged to people who were admitted to the hospital between 1910 and 1960, and they were filled with photos, stuffed animals, hygiene items, clothing, and other personal belongings that people had arrived at the hospital with. Several of the hospital's buildings are in use by the Department of Corrections, which maintains the property but have mostly fallen into disrepair. Until recently, the DOC offered occasional tours of the property, but the tours were discontinued due to growing concerns about the safety hazards posed by the deteriorating buildings. Number 3. Verscelli Psychiatric Hospital. Built in the early 1930s, the Verscelli Psychiatric Hospital was one of Italy's largest insane asylums during its years of operation. The sprawling complex occupied nearly 70 acres and consisted of 20 pavilions, at least 13 of which are completely abandoned today, as well as a small church. Inside some of the pavilions were a gymnasium, an auditorium, a children's area, and an area for patients' relatives. One area, known as the Carlo Forlanini Pavilion, housed the most severely mentally ill patients in small rooms. They underwent experimental treatment such as electroconvulsive therapy, which took place in the basement. During World War II, retaliating partisans massacred a group of fascist soldiers at the site. The Bassaglia Law, which required the dismantling of Italy's mental hospitals, went into effect in 1978, causing the Verscelli facility to close. Several pavilions were turned into a regular hospital, which remained in operation until 1991. The local health authority manages but does not use the property, and the area that remains in use houses an environmental association office. French photographer and urban explorer Sylvain Margin gained access to the off-limits buildings in 2015 and snapped pictures of the decrepit, dust-covered ruins. Humidity has destroyed the walls, plaster is crumbling, and thick vegetation has taken over the once manicured yard. Objects like wheelchairs, books, medical paperwork, and psychiatry magazines remain as an eerie reminder of the past goings-on in the now dark and silent buildings. Number 2. Povagia. Povagia is a small island located less than a half a mile from Venice in Italy's Venetian lagoon. It was first inhabited as early as the 5th century and was home to a civilian population until 1379, when war forced its residents to flee. In 1776, Povagia became a quarantine station for plague victims and patients who were suffering from other contagious diseases. From 1922 to 1968, the site operated as a mental hospital. The island has remained vacant ever since, despite efforts in recent years to turn it into a luxury vacation destination. More than 160 patients died in Povagia over the centuries. It's rumored that as much as half of the island's soil contains human remains. Archaeologists have found mass graves containing the remains of thousands of plague victims on nearby islands, but Povagia itself is yet to be fully investigated. According to legend, a doctor who worked at the mental hospital in Povagia tortured and killed patients before butchering their corpses. While these claims remain unsubstantiated, the remains of the hospital are still there, slowly being reclaimed by nature. Naturally, many people believe Povagia is haunted, but the island currently remains off-limits to visitors, and there's no word on if or when it will open up to tourism. For now, those who are curious about the supernatural can visit the nearby island of San Servolo, where the remains of an insane asylum are preserved as a museum. And at number 1, Ridgely Hospital. Built in 1916 in Lancaster, England, Ridgely Hospital was meant to function as a woman's ward of the nearby Lancaster Moor Mental Asylum. Its staff prioritized treating patients humanely, which was unusual for the time. The hospital experienced a major decline in its number of patients during a period in the 80s and 90s known as deinstitutionalization, when British leadership restructured its philosophy around mental health care toward keeping as many people out of hospitals as possible. Ridgely officially closed in 2013 and rapidly fell into a state of disrepair. Since then, the site has attracted looters, vandals, and curious explorers. Unlike many abandoned institutions, there are no major reports of Ridgely being haunted, but the neglected property is dangerous for other reasons, prompting public officials to plead with the public to stop trespassing onto the site. It's filled with asbestos, lead paint, broken glass, and other hazards that could easily result in injury or put someone's health in jeopardy. In recent years, the current property owners asked the government for permission to demolish the derelict hospital, noting that it's too damaged to be worth fixing up and repurposing. The local council denied the request, citing a lack of information regarding the possible environmental impacts of tearing the building down.
7. The Sanganid Colliery Disaster, 1913. The Sanganid Colliery Disaster of 1913 stands as a harsh chapter in the history of Welsh mining and highlights the perils faced by coal miners during this era. At 8 a.m. on Tuesday, October 14, 1913, a colossal explosion rocked the small town of Sanganid, which is situated north of Caerphilly, Wales. The disaster unfolded within the Universal Colliery, a vital source of employment in the area and a bustling hub of coal production. The explosion, accompanied by the release of poisonous gas, claimed the lives of 439 miners, making it the deadliest mining disaster in British history. Sadly, nearly 950 men had descended below the ground that fateful morning. The Universal Steam Coal Company, a subsidiary of Lewis Merthyr Consolidated Collieries, had established the Sanganid mine in 1891. And in the lead-up to World War I, the demand for Welsh coal, predominantly used to power Royal Navy battleships, was unprecedented. The Universal Colliery, privately owned and operated like many South Wales collieries, thrived during this period. It's thought that the cause of the tragedy most likely stemmed from an electrical spark igniting methane gas, fire damp, resulting in a devastating explosion. The initial blast ignited coal dust on the mine floor, leading to a sequence of self-producing explosions. The explosions were so fierce that they propelled the cage of the Lancaster pit back up the shaft, where it became wedged in the pit head winding gear. The subsequent fires and carbon monoxide left little hope for those who'd survived the initial blast, as oxygen was rapidly depleted. Rescue teams from nearby towns rushed to the scene, but their efforts were hindered by roof collapses, debris, and raging fires. Tragically, as days passed, the chances of finding survivors diminished, and the grim task of recovering bodies became the primary focus. Many of the deceased were so badly disfigured that they could only be identified by specific clothing items or personal belongings. The Sanganid disaster deeply impacted the town, affecting numerous community members through injuries or the loss of family members. 6. Texas City Disaster, 1947. On the morning of April 16, 1947, something horrible happened on the cargo ship SS Grand Camp. A fire broke out on the vessel, accidentally setting off a huge explosion due to the large amount of ammonium nitrate fertilizer on board. The ensuing blast was nothing short of apocalyptic, leveling the dock and the surrounding industrial area while setting off a chain reaction of 2 more explosions. The repercussions were devastating. The Texas City disaster claimed an estimated 581 lives, making it the deadliest industrial accident in U.S. history up to that point, with thousands more suffering injuries. The SS Grand Camp's explosion not only triggered a second blast at the nearby Monsanto Chemical Company plant, it also set fire to another ship, the SS High Flyer, which was full of ammonium nitrate as well. 16 hours later, the SS High Flyer erupted in yet another cataclysmic explosion, only adding to the devastation. The concussive force and debris from these blasts wreaked havoc across Texas City, damaging buildings, igniting new fires, and shattering windows. The explosion sent ship parts, dock equipment, rail cars, warehouses, and automobiles hurling into homes and businesses throughout the town. And in the aftermath, property losses reached an estimated $67 million. The Texas City disaster left the city without essential emergency services, as it had obliterated the entire firefighting apparatus and disrupted water and power supplies. Tragically, all 27 members of the volunteer fire department perished while attempting to combat the Grand Camp fire. Unfortunately, they had been unaware of the explosive potential of the ammonium nitrate. This tragedy prompted a massive volunteer rescue effort, with thousands of Red Cross and other volunteers descending upon the city to aid in recovery and identification efforts. The disaster prompted sweeping changes in regulations for the chemical manufacturing industry, including strict requirements for shipping and storing ammonium nitrate. It also led to the establishment of proactive industrial disaster planning measures across the country to prevent such a catastrophic event from occurring in the future. 5. The Chernobyl Disaster, 1984. The Chernobyl disaster of 1986, one of the worst nuclear accidents in history, took place in what used to be the Soviet Union, but is now Ukraine. The tragic event occurred between April 25th and 26th, when technicians at Reactor Unit 4 initiated a poorly conceived experiment. They tested the steam turbine's ability to power the emergency feedwater pumps in the event of a simultaneous loss of external power and coolant pipe rupture. They disabled the reactor's power regulating and emergency safety systems and withdrew most of the control rods while maintaining the reactor at 7% power. But at 1:23 a.m. on April 26th, the core's chain reaction spiraled out of control, leading to multiple explosions that shattered the reactor's heavy steel and concrete lid. This catastrophe resulted in a massive fire within the graphite reactor core, releasing copious amounts of radioactive material into the atmosphere, which were then carried far and wide by air currents. There was also an incident involving a partial core meltdown. The immediate aftermath was characterized by chaos. The 300,000 inhabitants of Pripyat city were evacuated, although there was an initial attempt to cover up the disaster. However, abnormally high levels of radioactivity detected by Swedish monitoring stations forced the Soviet government to acknowledge the incident on April 28th. This admission prompted international alarm over the perilous radioactive emissions. The death toll varied, with estimates ranging from 2 to approximately 50 individuals killed in the initial explosions, while dozens more suffered severe radiation sickness. Ultimately, the radioactive release amounted to between 50 and 185 million curies of radionuclides, which are radioactive forms of chemical elements, and this was several times more than the combined radioactivity of the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The contamination affected vast areas of land, spreading to Belarus, Russia, Ukraine, and even as far as France and Italy. Forests and farmlands were tainted, and despite evacuations, many stayed and lived in contaminated areas, unwilling to leave their hard-earned property. Deformed livestock and radiation-induced illnesses in humans were among the long-term consequences. The disaster revealed design flaws and unsafe practices in Soviet reactors, leading to increased scrutiny of nuclear power plants. Chernobyl Unit 2 was closed in 1991, Unit 1 followed suit in 1996, and Unit 3 did the same in 2000, when the power station was decommissioned. The Chernobyl disaster was so significant that they created a special area called an exclusion zone around the site. With the dissolution of the Soviet Union, control passed to Ukraine, and in 2011, parts of the exclusion zone opened for organized tours, attracting dark tourists. In 2022, during the Russian invasion of Ukraine, concerns arose about the potential damage to the containment structure and the risk of widespread radioactive contamination at the site of this catastrophic nuclear event. In the future, would you ever visit the site of the Chernobyl disaster out of morbid curiosity? Let us know what you think in the comments down below. And while you're at it, subscribe to the channel. 4. The Bhopal Disaster, 1984. The Bhopal chemical leak occurred on the night of December 2, 1984, at the Union Carbide India Limited (UCIL) pesticide plant, which is located in Bhopal, Madhya Pradesh, India. Regarded as the world's worst industrial disaster, it unleashed a cloud of highly toxic methyl isocyanate (MIC) gas, affecting over 500,000 people in the nearby towns. The leak was caused by a number of factors, including inadequate safety measures, maintenance negligence, and a chemical reaction triggered by water contamination. The official death toll reported immediately after the disaster was 2,259 lives lost. However, estimates vary, with some suggesting that approximately 8,000 individuals perished within 2 weeks of the gas leak. Additionally, thousands more succumbed to gas-related diseases in the years that followed. The Union Carbide Corporation, UCC, of the United States was the majority owner of the UCIL plant, holding a significant stake in the company. And in the aftermath of the disaster, UCC reached a settlement in 1989, paying $470 million in compensation, equivalent to approximately $907 million in 2021, to address the legal claims arising from the tragedy. The ownership of UCIL subsequently changed hands, with UCC selling its stake in favor of Eveready Industries India Limited, EIIL, which later merged with McLeod Russell India Limited. Eveready concluded its cleanup efforts at the site in 1998, relinquishing its 99-year lease and transferring control of the premises to the state government of Madhya Pradesh. The disaster stands as a solemn reflection of the pressing matters concerning corporate responsibility, safety regulations, and the ongoing pursuit of justice and compensation for the victims and their families. 2. The Rana Plaza building collapse, 2013. At one point in time, the 8-story Rana Plaza building, located on the outskirts of Dhaka, Bangladesh, housed a myriad of shops, a bank, and garment factories. But in 2013, it would become synonymous with tragedy. The catastrophe began when large structural cracks were discovered in the building on April 23rd. The shops and the bank on the lower floors promptly closed their doors. However, the warnings about the building's structural integrity were blatantly disregarded by the owners of the garment factories occupying the upper floors. Under immense management pressure, thousands of garment workers were coerced into returning to work within the compromised Rana Plaza building on April 24th. Tragedy struck just hours later when the entire structure collapsed, entombing its occupants beneath tons of rubble and machinery. The catastrophic collapse claimed the lives of 1,134 workers, including rescue personnel, while leaving nearly 2,600 workers with life-altering injuries, with some even requiring amputations. Many survivors endured harrowing ordeals, trapped for hours or even days before rescue, bearing the physical and emotional scars of their experience. The Rana Plaza disaster cast a shadow of devastation over the lives of countless workers and their families. Immediate and long-term medical care, as well as compensation, became imperative to alleviate their unimaginable suffering. The global community watched in shock and horror as the true extent of this tragedy came to light, prompting worldwide campaigns for justice for the victims and safer working conditions within the garment industry. 1. Port Neches TPC Group LLC plant explosion, 2019. The Port Neches explosion, which occurred at the TPC Group petrochemical plant in Port Neches, Texas, was a catastrophic industrial disaster that had far-reaching consequences. The incident was a result of a dangerous chemical material known as popcorn polymer expanding inside a 16-inch diameter pipe over a period of more than 100 days. This material created significant pressure against the pipe's metal walls until it ruptured on the night before Thanksgiving in 2019. The rupture of the pipe released 6,000 gallons of liquid butadiene, a highly flammable petroleum-based chemical used in plastic production. The butadiene rapidly vaporized into a cloud and ignited, causing a massive explosion that was felt by people up to 30 miles away. Subsequent explosions followed, further damaging the plant and surrounding areas. The U.S. Chemical Safety Board, CSB, conducted an investigation into the incident and found that the TPC Group had failed to identify problem areas where popcorn polymer could accumulate. Furthermore, the company never implemented safety recommendations to regularly flush pipes connected to out-of-service equipment, a measure that could have prevented the disaster. The consequences of the explosion were severe. Nearby homes and buildings were damaged, and residents were forced to evacuate or shelter in place. Local schools also had to cancel classes due to the damage caused by the explosions, which resulted in $153 million in off-site property damage. The CSB's investigation also revealed that the TPC Group had missed opportunities to prevent the disaster, including not implementing internal policies for cleaning butadiene units with high levels of hazardous popcorn polymer. And to make matters worse, the facility lacked remotely operated emergency isolation valves that could have minimized subsequent explosions. In response to the incident, the TPC Group stated that it had invested millions of dollars into improving equipment and safety programs, and had implemented measures to review systems for mitigating butadiene hazards. However, they filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy and reached a settlement with creditors to address the financial fallout of the disaster. The history of industrial catastrophes reminds us of the devastating consequences when safety is compromised and accountability is neglected. These tragic events have left lasting marks on communities and the world, prompting us to reflect on the importance of responsible industry practices and vigilant oversight. From the haunting echoes of the Bhopal gas tragedy to the heart-wrenching stories of the Rana Plaza disaster, each incident highlights the need for strict safety regulations, ethical corporate conduct, and swift response to mitigate harm. These disasters have not only claimed lives, but have also brought about meaningful change. Lessons learned from such calamities have led to the implementation of stricter safety protocols, better disaster preparedness, and increased awareness about the human and environmental costs of industrial negligence. A televised war. The war was actually the first televised war. On a nightly basis, Americans would tune into their TVs to watch bombing missions, soldiers on patrol, and scenes full of intense actual combat. These images put the war into the living rooms of millions of Americans all over the country. The reality of battles and bloodshed became must-watch television. It also put a face on the soldiers that were lost in combat and the civilians who were swept up in the middle of the chaos. The Vietnam War has been largely viewed as a war that was lost. One of the reasons behind the defeat was that Americans had the opportunity to see the good, the bad, and the ugly sides of this conflict from the comfort of their own homes. World War II coverage was conducted primarily through newspapers and the radio. Journalists had to follow strict guidelines and censorship rules forbidding images that were even remotely upsetting. What people saw with World War II coverage was more propaganda than anything else. Everything changed with the war in Vietnam, as people were given a harsh reality check. Television boomed in popularity during the 1950s, and for the first time, owning a television became a must. Only 9% of the US population owned a TV in 1950, but the number grew sharply to 99% by 1966. Television fought a fierce battle with newspapers and radio for entertainment and news coverage. By the 1960s, more Americans were getting their news from TV than ever before. The major networks decided to set aside 30 minutes dedicated to the nightly news and major stories. The war in Vietnam was hands down one of the most important stories taking place during the 1960s. Lyndon Baines Johnson was President of the United States when the country entered the war in 1965. He inherited the presidency after the tragic assassination of President John F. Kennedy in 1963. And that's not all he inherited. The United States decided to take action in Vietnam to try and contain communism. The fear was that if one nation fell apart, a domino effect would take place. China had been lost, and there was a growing fear that East Asia would also fall to communism like Eastern Europe. The United States decided to step in and help South Vietnam in their battle against the communist Northern Vietnam. There were about 20,000 US troops in Vietnam during 1965. But just 3 years later, there were over 500,000 US troops. As the war continued, the fighting intensified, and the public's opinion shifted. It was 1968 when North Vietnam launched the Tet Offensive, a well-coordinated attack on South Vietnam that led to countless losses. A 1968 poll showed that 63% of the US population believed the Vietnam War was a major mistake. Along with the Tet Offensive, networks wanted increased coverage. They wanted more combat scenes for their dedicated viewers. The constant coverage and the unpopularity of the war led President Johnson to the decision not to seek re-election in 1968. Voters in the United States elected a new president in 1968. They had an opportunity to find a path to end the war, or else they'd continue with the madness that divided an entire nation. The role television played was pivotal to reporting the news coming out of Vietnam. It was created what was referred to as the living room war. By televising the war, the visions of the battlefield were burned into the minds of an entire generation. It would shape how wars were covered in the future, and it fueled the anti-war movement. How the media covered the war definitely changed. Correspondents would be extremely near the battles, and they'd show the actual conflict in action. What are your thoughts on the reporting of war in general? Let us know what you think in the comments below. And if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to the channel. A divisive war and a country in chaos. While the war was being broadcast across the world, people were taking to the streets to voice their opposition to the fighting. Protests started in 1965, with the most notable being the March on Washington, D.C. that took place in April 1965. Some 15,000 to 25,000 people showed up to oppose the war. A pro-war rally was also held the same year in Washington, D.C. in October, and almost 25,000 people attended. In April 1967, protests were held in major cities like New York and San Francisco. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. famously spoke at the event in New York. Many of those who protested were young Americans. The reason why was because they were the ones being drafted into the war. A draft started in 1966, and students began protesting the selection of only men for service. Events at the University of Wisconsin at Madison and the University of Chicago ranged from peaceful protests to students occupying campus buildings demanding changes to draft policies. By 1968, protests were escalating steadily as the war became more and more unpopular. America became a crisis country in 1968. Civil rights leader Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee on April 4, 1968. Riots erupted. Robert F. Kennedy, the brother of John F. Kennedy, was seen as the man who would earn the Democrats' nomination as candidate for President of the United States. Sadly, Kennedy was also assassinated in Los Angeles, California on June 6, 1968. The 1968 Democratic Convention was supposed to be held in Chicago, Illinois during August 1968, and the city turned into a madhouse as the Chicago police clubbed anti-war protesters in the streets. 1968 turned into a chaotic year for the United States. Richard Nixon was elected president, and he showed no signs of backing out of the Vietnam War. Protests continued in the U.S. well into the early 1970s, and the most infamous protest happened at Ohio's Kent State University. On May 4, 1970, National Guardsmen fired into a crowd of students, killing 4 protesters. The reason for the protests was thanks to the war extending into Cambodia, which was announced not long before by President Nixon. A tired nation decided to protest, including students at Kent State University. Days of tension led to the infamous attack. Many U.S. cities and college campuses took a long time to heal after these countless protests and riots. Agent Orange and napalm. Napalm was a jellied gasoline that was used during the Vietnam War. It was first created in 1942 as part of a Harvard project known as Anonymous Research Project No. 4. It was tested on a soccer field on the university's campus. It would later become a key weapon for U.S. bombing missions. It rained down on Vietnam from 1963 until 1973. 100,000 tons of napalm was dropped in 1968 alone. Vietnam was not the first war where napalm was utilized. During World War II, about 690,000 pounds of napalm was dropped on Tokyo. What is unbelievable is that it was dropped in such a short amount of time, and it still killed about 87,000 people. Its use continued into the Korean War, and Americans had a front-row seat to the use of napalm during the Vietnam War. Television reports and photographs showed the sheer destruction of this brutal weapon. Victims were shown badly burned or even burned to death. A 1967 New York Times article stated, "Anyone who survives a napalm attack is apt to be dreadfully burned and, without first-rate medical care, is condemned to a lingering, painful death, or at best, permanent disfigurement." When dropped and ignited, napalm could burn up to 1,500 to 2,200 degrees Fahrenheit. It was a horrible liquid fire that showed no mercy in its destruction. Napalm clung to anything, including human skin, and it burned people alive. So why was it used by the US military? One pilot remembered, "People have this thing about being burned to death." Dow Chemical, a company in Midland, Michigan that created Saran Wrap, was actually awarded a contract in 1965 by the US government to make napalm. Dow tried recruiting college students in the 1960s, but were instead met by anti-war protesters. Another deadly weapon used during the Vietnam War was Agent Orange. It was an herbicide that was sprayed to destroy the food supply of communists in North Vietnam. The main purpose of it was to defoliate forests in certain regions to discourage communist soldiers from seeking shelter in the woods. Since 1962, it's believed that almost 100 million pounds of herbicides like Agent Orange were sprayed on some 4 million acres of land in Vietnam. It was also sprayed in neighboring countries like Laos, Cambodia, and Thailand, but information about the amount actually used is unavailable. Spraying reportedly killed about 1,000 civilians and 13,000 livestock. Agent Orange and other herbicides were incredibly toxic, and their legacy created countless problems for the Vietnamese and US troops that were exposed to the chemicals. An Encyclopedia Britannica entry for Agent Orange said, "Exposure to Agent Orange is considered to be the cause of abnormally high incidence of miscarriages, skin diseases, cancers, birth defects, and congenital malformations, often extreme and grotesque, dating from the 1970s. Almost 150,000 Vietnamese children were born with birth defects thanks to Agent Orange and other herbicides used during the war. 3 million US soldiers that served during the Vietnam War were exposed to chemicals like Agent Orange. In total, 9 million people served for the US military during the war in Vietnam. The US government invested about $400 million to environmental cleanup and benefits for people with disabilities from Agent Orange. The US states that it's rather difficult to determine if Agent Orange was the actual cause of the disabilities in certain cases. The use of Agent Orange finally stopped in 1971 by the US government after the harmful effects were fully realized. Veterans from the US and other countries tried taking the producers of Agent Orange and other herbicides to court in the 1970s, with the case being settled out of court years later in 1984. 250,000 claimants and their families were granted access to a $180 million fund. It is reported that 300,000 Vietnam veterans passed away from diseases and complications linked to the exposure of herbicides like Agent Orange. Children of these veterans believe that their father's exposure to Agent Orange possibly affected them in different ways. Some claim that different cancers are linked to Agent Orange, along with complications to pregnancies and more. The trouble for Vietnam vets. Veterans that came home from the war were not even given a grand homecoming. They were met with cold shoulders in a country that was divided over war. Adjustment was difficult, and many Vietnam veterans struggled after their return. Some turned to drugs and alcohol just to cope. Something that impacted the veterans more than other war veterans was their time in combat. Vietnam War veterans typically saw 240 days of combat. Those who served during World War II saw just 40. Retired Marine Sergeant Andrew Brandy conducted research and found that some Vietnam veterans saw an astonishing 1,200 days of combat. If you think you don't have issues after 1,200 days of combat, you need to think again, said Brandy. What was lacking for many veterans returning from Vietnam was resources like counseling. The time when veterans were coming home was a time when mental health institutions in the United States were experiencing a period of change. Many fell through the cracks, and a 1991 article titled "Vietnam Era and Vietnam Combat Veterans Among the Homeless" stated that 43 to 50% of homeless men at the time were actually Vietnam veterans. The period in which these men were homeless ranged from a month to over a year. It is still important to examine this pressing issue. The ability to adjust after war proved difficult for some veterans. Homelessness and addiction have been major issues from the 1980s well into the 2000s. This was a similar situation faced by veterans of the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. Unexploded bombs and landmines. Although U.S. involvement in Vietnam officially ended in 1975, there are still problems in the country today with unexploded bombs and landmines. A 2023 Al Jazeera article said that out of all the artillery used in the Vietnam War, a third of it never exploded. One province alone has had 3,500 deaths since the war ended, thanks to people finding unexploded bombs and landmines. But Vietnam as a nation has experienced a total of 100,000 deaths due to this major issue. A British organization called the Mines Advisory Group has spent time in Vietnam since 1999 to search the land with metal detectors for hidden dangers. From 1993 until 2020, the United States invested $166 million on programs to help with landmines and unexploded bombs in Vietnam. About 67 square miles have been searched, but it is going to take another 13 years to completely clear Vietnam of unexploded bombs and landmines. There are even stories of children finding these dangerous items and playing with them. In some cases, nothing happens, but in others. This is not just an isolated issue. PBS reported that the State Department estimates around 60 to 75 million landmines remain unexploded in the ground worldwide. The US is involved in similar programs in Iraq, Afghanistan, Laos, and Cambodia to combat this. Do you have any other stories related to the Vietnam War you'd like us to make a video about? Let us know in the comments. And if you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one. Bye!